In front of me, I have a few front row seats available. So if you'd like to take this golden opportunity to make sure that you are in the front row when we have this discussion, I'd like to request you to kindly come in and join us as well. ठ्याक्क गेटको अगाडि हुनुभएका सम्पूर्ण अतिथि महानुभावहरूलाई हलभित्र आइदिनुहुनका लागि हामी हार्दिक अनुरोध गर्न चाहन्छौँ. Harnessing green finance for sustainable investment is our topic of conversation. We'd like to welcome our presenter and moderator, Ms. Radhika Lal, Finance Policy Advisor for UNDP Bangkok, to join us. Thank you very much, ma'am, for taking on this role as a presenter and as a moderator as well. And without any further delay, if I may please request Ms. Radhika Lal for her presentation on harnessing green finance for sustainable investments and to kick off this session as well.
Hello everyone, really pleased to be here, and sorry about that, we had a malfunction with the other mic. So starting now, and I think just to bring everyone onto the same page, the idea is to just provide a little bit of a framework beyond the regulations that government can introduce and the role of the different stakeholders which we have on the floor towards making the ecosystem work for green finance, just to provide a bit of a framework for what is green finance and what are the different roles that government can play in really shaping the market for green transformation in countries like Nepal. Sorry. So the first, just again to bring us to the same page, it's to look at what is the scope for green finance. So you can see that it's much broader than looking at climate finance, but much smaller still than looking at the overall package of sustainable finance. So green includes both climate as well as a whole range of areas for financing of different green sectors and investments. And within this framework, government has lots of different options, if you like, for shaping the market for green transformation, from looking at its own budget and development plans, to the use of monetary and fiscal policy instruments, taxes, expenditures, carbon pricing, as well as the whole focus on public and private bonds and other debt and other instruments, as well as promoting how private investment itself functions in terms of taking on board risk, as well as promoting the alignment of private investment with the SDGs and climate, and then looking at the overall sustainability-linked frameworks. Sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing the slide from here. And it's really critical to have an integrated approach. So we'll hear lots about, different regulations, different policy instruments, including taxonomies yesterday and earlier today. But it's important really to look at the whole mix of instruments, because governments in different countries have different flexibility in terms of what they can do through those different instruments. And in terms of creating fiscal space, it's really important to look at government expenditure, but also taxation in terms of what can be achieved. Yeah, so if you look at Nepal's, Nepal was really a pioneer in terms of looking at how it's spending its own budget, tagging the budget, with regard to green, one of the earliest countries actually in Asia Pacific to do that. And then also looking at it in terms of its planning and other frameworks. So this is something that's quite important. but it's also a continuous journey. That kind of tagging approach that was used initially, is evolving in many countries to be much more aligned to policy priorities in terms of NDCs, to be outcome focused, similar to the taxonomy. So really a continuous process of looking at how budgets and plans are aligned with the overall green transformation agenda, the grid, as well for Nepal. Also, there's a lot of vertical funds that Nepal is tapping into. And the idea is not to look at these as silos again, but really how that mix of grant and concessional and private capital can really be helped to achieve, some of the sector-specific priorities. I think we've heard also quite a lot around the whole focus on innovative finance. In fact, there was a fascinating panel just before this, really looking at the role of different entities, working through financial institutions and providing loans directly to different actors as well, mobilizing resources on international and other capital markets, and we'll get a different perspective from the DFIs and stakeholders on this platform. There's also work underway in looking at the climate change financing framework, and where it's really looking at the sources of finance, how best to align these sources with what's there on the market, from a policy, system, capability, transparency perspective. And this, also needs to align well with the investment framework. But here it's important just to link these different aspects. In many of the other countries, there's not a great focus on the private sector. And given the growing importance of the private sector, these types of frameworks really also need to take into account some of those changes. These, we should admit from the start that it's really complex for governments, to balance different priorities. So if you take, the focus on e-mobility, which is a priority for government, and very ambitious targets by 2030, but if your taxes come from there, providing that tax subsidy or lower taxes, also comes at a cost for government, and raises the question of really how do you deal with these different types of trade-offs. And Nepal has, seen tremendous growth, for example, in EVs over the last couple of years, but even before that, all those little tempos and minivans, a lot of those were, electric from the get-go. When even India, for example, went through a phase of using CNG, Nepal went directly into this. So it's possible to see, huge transformational benefits, although it's still very much a work in progress, and I think just 1% of the market is EV. So just in terms of covering a few of the instruments, not all of them, there are a range of different instruments and approaches that Nepal is also looking at, from risk transfer and insurance, the use of different guarantees, debt financing, equity financing. And just to run quickly through a couple of different bonds, there's interest in thematic bonds, particularly in green bonds, which need to align with the different principles from ICMA. But what's also interesting is to look at what are coming. Those are covered by use of proceeds bonds. What's really important and interesting is also to look at sustainability-linked bonds, which have been used by the private sector to really support its transformation, but increasingly is also being used by sovereigns. Chile was the first sovereign to do that, including both green and social objectives. In their case, the social objective was increasing the presence of women on corporate boards, which they also had legislation and others to foster, but to show that you can in fact combine green and social, which is also becoming increasingly important in the context of just transitions. And you can see now there's the top light green part is the sustainability linked. It's increasingly growing, although, as I mentioned, it's still very much green bonds dominate, but those other categories have really come up post-COVID, and there is tremendous scope also for Nepal. Here's just a quick example of one of the pioneers in the Asia-Pacific region, really Indonesia, which started off with the first sovereign green sukuks, the Sharia-compliant instruments, but then went very quickly to an SDG bond framework, which they're using to issue SDG bonds, blue bonds, green bonds. And so this is really the innovation of having one overarching bond framework under which to issue a multiplicity of different types of bonds. And maybe this is something that Nepal could also look at, which is even if it wants to issue a green bond, to look at such an umbrella framework, which gives it the flexibility of combining different types of portfolios, of different, green, blue, other kind of elements, given that you also have to come up with a pipeline. But also looking at sustainability-linked bonds where there isn't a focus on use of proceeds. You don't need to have a portfolio of initiatives to finance, but really looking at what are the KPIs that the country can meet in a much more ambitious way. And Uruguay, which UNDP supported, was one of the first to have both a step up and a step down. So if it met the KPIs, actually Nepal would get, in this case, Nepal would get a benefit in terms of the coupon rate. So this is something that's maybe of interest because thus far we've seen that green bonds don't necessarily offer a premium, a greenium, for countries. So you put in all the effort, but the coupon rates could be quite similar to just a vanilla bond. So it's often a question we get asked. With a sustainability-linked bond with a step up and a step down, there is the possibility of the country getting a much better deal by showing an ambitious level of commitment. And the KPIs can be some mix of mitigation, adaptation, social, a variety of different KPIs. So countries like Nepal would also have that kind of flexibility. And you would say, why should Nepal issue a green bond? What's the benefit? And one of the things we've heard from Indonesia and others, which are some of the, from developing countries, some of the largest issuers, is really to tap into different types of capital, impact capital, patient capital that's willing to invest longer, that also wants to build up its own portfolio of sustainable assets. And even though they're not immediate price benefits, but there is that medium-term benefit in terms of the bonds. Several factors to consider, and I think we've also heard a lot of what Nepal Rashtra Bank is doing to minimize the risks in terms of currency fluctuations and other things to make it much more feasible for both the government itself, but also private sector to issue thematic bonds. A number of interesting examples of countries issuing both vanilla and thematic bonds, with dual tranches, or looking at issuing in the domestic market and cross-listing on other exchanges at the same time. Germany was one of the countries to do that. And so countries like Nepal, which haven't issued such bonds before, can really get a sense of the different pricing and interest as well from partners in both vanilla and thematic bonds. Also quite important is defining what's green in this kind of context. So a number of countries, but also in the Asia-Pacific region, regional taxonomies for ASEAN, for example, which could also be quite interesting for, say, a number of the mountain economies, which have a particular type of focus on a particular energy profile, to think about, more typology-based taxonomies, country typology, or but this is something that's coming up, and we know that Nepal has is working on finalizing its green taxonomy. And just for those who are not familiar, the taxonomy really defines, in this case, green, what counts as green, the different sectors, projects, what are the thresholds that would define, what could be done, and so this sort of sets up the framework for that. But again, just to make the point, and then I conclude, is that the taxonomy is not an end in itself. It really needs to be seen within the broader mix of policy instruments, including what, the bond framework, looking at the fiscal incentives that government would likely want to offer, as well to facilitate this transformation to green. So really think of it as a package of measures, of policy and regulatory measures, but also government's own action to really shape the market for a green transformation. Thank you very much, and now we will turn over to the moderated discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lal, for your insightful presentation and the perspective that you've put forward in your presentation. You've taken a dual role of presenting as well as moderating, so may I please now request you to kindly I'll hand over the session to you and request you to kindly carry forward with the proceedings of this session.
Thank you very much. So let's start the discussion with the first question going to government. So Mr. Marasani, the Secretary, Ministry of Finance, can you tell us, to kick the discussion off, what are the specific policy measures that government is implementing to incentivize investment in green industries and to promote sustainable practices amongst businesses in Nepal?
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Radhika Lal. Actually, I learned a lot about your presentation. Thank you for the presentation. I believe that the hall also learned a lot about on green financing from her presentation. Excellent presentation. On your questions, let me begin with two examples. How much government of Nepal has been preparing for the green financing. I don't know if the hall is, all knows about it or not, but the government of Nepal, has introduced its climate coding in its annual budgeting. We are the pioneering countries, right? That is the sensitivity of the government of Nepal, to introduce the green financing, and we begin that from our own outlays. How much our allocation is climate sensitive, how much our allocation is supporting for the green economy. That's how we have been doing, and that's ongoing for over a decade already now. Next is that we are the maybe very first or early signatories of the green initiatives, that means green and inclusive development initiatives. So actually, 2 years back, I was the one who signed that initiatives on behalf of the government of Nepal. So these two instances, these two examples already, tells you how much government of Nepal has been serious and how the government of Nepal has been preparing for green financing, going forward. So coming back to your particular question, what specific policy, these were the policies, but let me elaborate a couple of more policies so that the hall will understand how government is preparing. So the government of Nepal is committed to promoting green industries and sustainable practices as part of its broader development agenda. To incentivize investment in green sectors, the government has implemented several policy measures. These include providing tax incentives, subsidies, and financial support to business that adopt environmentally friendly practices and invest in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, waste management, and climate resilient infrastructures. Additionally, the government has introduced regulations and standards to ensure environmental sustainability and promote responsible business practices. Going beyond that, not only the government, of Nepal's its own preparations, our own provisions for the green financing, we have been also well coordinating with international funds such as the Global Climate Fund, the GEF, the Climate Investment Fund. These are the windows of opportunities for the green financing available in Nepal. And we have also been making contact with other private IFIs who are keen on providing green financing into Nepal. So I think let me stop here. Thank you.
Turning to Mr. Rodrigo Pereira Porto from the World Bank to get, the DFI perspective that you've been working very closely with the government to really understand what are the key policy reforms, regulatory measures, from your perspective, from the DFI perspective, needed to create an enabling environment for green finance in Nepal, and how can the World Bank and DFIs, and how are they supporting the government in implementing these reforms?
Thank you. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank for the invitation, thank the organization, and take the opportunity to greet all the audience, all my fellow friends here, colleagues at the panel. Well, when it comes to the government role in facilitating this green finance flow, I think the first question that we should ask is understanding investment needs. And that's a kind of tricky question, because if we take green finance flow in a perspective, we see that most of financial resources designated to concessional finance, to loans, to technical expertise, mostly of them are driven to climate change, climate finance, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. And that's a reason for that to happen. But before that, I learned that Nepal contributes only 0.01% to carbon emissions at global level. That's nearly zero. And we're talking about most of financial resources, most of the flows designated to to climate change mitigation. So how does it apply to emerging markets like Nepal? So for the government, it's important to have that in mind, because if they want to harness green finance and find priorities, find sectors, actions, activities, they must understand how they're going to use those resources in terms of financing, in terms of developing capacities and sharing knowledge with different partners on this green finance supply-demand chain. So I learned at the World Bank, and I think mainstream understands that investment needs are larger in countries that contribute the least to carbon emissions at global level. That seems quite unfair. And there's a reason for that, because we're not talking about carbon emissions at this point in time. We're talking about vulnerability to climate change and how climate change impacts your country in terms of physical risks, climate-related physical risks, flooding, droughts, and other issues that may impact facilities, that may impact business, that may disrupt business and cause impacts on economy and impact the resilience of financial sector. And there's also transition risks as well, the same perspective. So Nepal should understand that harnessing green finance toward climate change mitigation has a dual purpose. The first one is mitigating risks. Understanding the vulnerabilities of the country, of different sectors within the economy, and finding information, finding data, and having the government, through different institutions, public entities, to do their job according to their mandate, to understand the impact of that on the business, on the portfolios. But there's also the opportunity side. And this is what conveys a good message, because investing on green and climate change mitigation, it's not only about mitigating risks, it's about harnessing the green finance flow. It's about taking the opportunity to foster a sustainable economic development transition plan. That means make firms more productive, investing in new technologies, so those very same firms can be more competitive at international level, they can create more jobs, they can impact social good in Nepal, it can impact the economy in a positive way. So I make this introduction just to make the case, because sometimes it's a little tricky when we talk about climate change mitigation, especially in emerging countries. I'm from Brazil, it's a big country. It contributes much more to carbon emissions than Nepal. And not that much, I imagine, than your neighboring countries, like India, for example, that contributes up to 7% of carbon emissions. Not to mention China, up to 30% maybe at global level. So what's the role of the government? So the government should understand how this supply and demand framework on green finance works. I have a slide. I don't know if we can put on a slide, but no problem. There's no problem. I'd like to show you a picture from a World Bank publication called the Toolkits for Policymakers in Greening the Financial Sector. This is a publication that is publicly available. It's just downloading on the World Bank site. And it shows different buckets in which policymakers can act in order to foster green finance, in order to foster, in fact, a more sustainable financial sector. So the first thing is understanding this value chain, understanding the supply-demand green finance framework. And we have different players. We have international organizations in one point, we have the government in the other, we have the private sector, and it's the role of each player to try to connect those dots and fill the gaps between them. So how to connect the dots between international organizations and the government? That's the first challenge. It's a key challenge. So it's important for the country to understand investments needs. It's important for the country to have information, to collect data, and try to devise a plan, a strategic plan, which is viable, which is consistent, which is accurate. So it's going to be easier to connect the dots to the international organizations, to the international financial community, and also to connect the dots with the private sector. And the private sector, I mean financial institutions, non-financial institutions, households, the academy, you name it, the whole economy. And to connect the dots with the private sector, it's important to establish a process in which you exchange, in which you develop capacity, in which you set a dialogue with the private sector in order to make it happen. And this is a big gap in most emerging markets, is to fill the gaps between the government and the private sector. Most of the funding that we see at international level is still comprised by public money, public resources. We should leverage private sector capital in order to blend finance and make it less costly and make more attractive for the private sector to get into. When it comes to government, it's also important to promote this enabling environment so the private sector can connect the dots directly with the international organization as well, like the IFC is doing. IFC is promoting loans with banks directly to finance SMEs portfolios here in Nepal. And that's very important because it's not only a green finance movement, it also has impacts on the social. and on the broad concept of sustainability.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Reporter.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to, just to keep time, maybe you can come back to some of that
Sure.
in the second round. And actually quite important to look, as he was mentioning, at really the characteristics of the country. Nepal has a lot of renewable, it doesn't need as much mitigation, finance, although there is irony in the fact that if you look at Kathmandu, where 70%, which is in a valley, which does need, some of that kind of financing for e-mobility and other things to make that transition. And interestingly, also for China, one of the main motivations of going towards e-mobility was really to cut back on pollution. Subsequently, they became a world leader in terms of the new energy and EVs and other vehicles, but the original motivation was really cutting back on pollution. So, really a mix of financing needed. Let's turn now to Mr. Jason Ving to get your perspective, as a Chief Sustainability Officer from Standard Chartered Bank. So as the lead for sustainability partnerships, working out of Singapore, how do you perceive the current landscape of green finance in emerging markets like Nepal? And what opportunities do you see for sustainable investments, from the perspective of a financial institution?
Thank you very much. So there's always that nervous moment. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great, thank you. Honorable Vice Chairman, Honorable Secretary, distinguished guests and panelists. On behalf of Standard Chartered, thank you all thank you for the government and the organizers for giving us this platform to share the private sector finance perspective. Over the last day and a half, we've heard a great number of perspectives, the opportunities and of course the numerous challenges that we're all trying to work with the government to solve. I'll keep my comments fairly kind of narrow and focused to our perspective as an international bank, both present here in Nepal, but of course a footprint with access to some of the capital that Rodrigo mentioned, that's keen to access the opportunities here in Nepal, but we need to help demystify it. So why are we talking about harnessing green investment? This is not new capital necessarily. This is not a silver bullet to the economic needs of Nepal. It comes from the climate, the real climate impact that we see globally, and we've already heard people mention the specific challenges or impact in Nepal. The second side is the supply of this capital. The regulatory environment is evolving, and the investors, the next generation, are starting to insist that their capital goes to ESG related to investments. So the die and the direction is already set. So it's about scalability. It's about providing the platform, the policy framework, the understanding of the needs for these private investors, for private commercial banks. It's a very small market here in Nepal. So to catalyze, we need to provide that platform, the regulatory understanding for these investors. So what do you need? You need a enabling policy and regulatory environment. You need strong institutions and a whole of government approach. You need access to capital. So that's not only the ability to bring capital in, it's the ability to manage that risk, both from an FX and interest rate capability, and very important is the ability to exit, right? So that two-way, that capital flow of cash and financing into and out of Nepal to create that financial ecosystem. The fourth one, and this is really important, is the quality of information and the capacity of the government and the institutions to be able to manage verifications, to manage third parties, to bring that confidence of investors into the country. So what is the prize? It's about unlocking not only the policy toolkit, but the financial toolkit. So Radhika, in your opening comments, the sovereign SDG bond of Indonesia, that is truly the flagship opportunity that sits in front of the government of Nepal. I think a number of us have heard about the need for a credit rating. I think I have to echo that. That does remove a lot of the friction in understanding the credit. Of course, the off-taker here is the government in itself. So that really is your benchmark for a number of investors. SDG bonds, the various formats of it, we have sustainability-linked loans that are being very popular within the Singapore ASEAN taxonomy that was mentioned. And not to scare anybody, but the next phase really is ESG derivatives. So the innovation is there, but we don't need to rush into it, right? We really are at the start of a very complex journey that a number of participants here are trying to solve for. So at the end of the day, it's about blending, it's about collaboration. The number of development finance institutions, official institutions here in Kathmandu is astounding. So the challenge is back to the private financial sector to try and bring that together, to try and bring consistency, and to understand how to catalyze and amplify that capital that's already here. So the final piece is education. So as a bank that both has a retail branch, an institutional and investment bank, and an international footprint, we do feel uniquely placed to bring some of that, those questions, the investor needs, back here into Kathmandu, as well as act as advocates for the journey here itself.
Thank you. Really important role in terms of also connecting to ESG investors, and we haven't even gotten into green deposits and other types of engagements there. But I think there's been also quite a lot of talk right through around the need to de-risk, and who better than the IFC to bring into that discussion. So now turning to, I hope I'm saying your name right, Ono Makopone. Okay, embarrassed about that. Yeah. So turning to you now to really tell us a little bit from the IFC perspective, really the potential for green finance, particularly in Nepal's infrastructure as part of this priorities, as part of this green transformation agenda.
First of all, thank you very much for having us. I think the very first question is, why green finance as opposed to any normal kind of project finance or corporate finance loan? And when you look at the infrastructure needs of Nepal, it's significant. I mean, research has said that Nepal will need about 10 to 12% of GDP to be invested annually for the next decade in order to actually reach its infrastructure goals. So the question is, how do you actually get there? So clearly it can't be all on the government purse. It has to be via private capital. And then when you look at private capital, you need to actually be able to afford the facility. So when we look at green finance, I mean, you said it very clearly in your presentation, green finance has the ability to actually support Nepal's transition to a sustainable economy. There are several sort of subsectors that could attract, specifically for Nepal, that could attract green finance. I mean, Nepal in itself is a green finance haven. Goes without saying, renewable energy. You mentioned EVs, so clean transportation, so not just for private vehicles, but also on the public side as well. Wastewater management, smart climate finance in the field of agricultural financing. Now, coming specifically to the IFC, how we look at, well, we usually call it climate funding investment. I'm going to call it that as opposed to green financing. So you basically have to fall into two broad buckets, right? Rodrigo mentioned climate mitigation and adaptation. So on the mitigation side, we're focused on projects that will that are along the decarbonization pathway. So specifically renewable energy, right? And there's a lot of investment on the hydro side, and we've actually invested alongside development partners in the Upper Tishuli hydro project. ISC alone actually put in almost $200 million in that project between debt and equity, mobilizing concessional funding as well to make sure that the project was bankable, right? And also, when we're looking at wastewater management as well, we're also focused on areas that will not do the environment any harm. Then on the climate adaptation and resilience bucket, our focus is on projects that will manage the physical climate change effectively. So we're talking about disaster systems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in addition to the Upper Tishuli project, our focus has also been on how can we actually mobilize capital through financial institutions like a Standard Chartered. So we provide a lot of funding through these institutions, whether it's by way of risk-sharing facilities or partial credit guarantees, not just in Nepal, but we have several examples of that in India, for instance, when we've done sustainability-linked bonds. So even in Sri Lanka, we're looking at green bond issuances through the financial institutions. So from an LIC perspective, we're not just interested in what can we put on our books, on our balance sheet. How can we actually facilitate private capital mobilization through the instruments that we offer?
Great. Thank you. Really comprehensive response. And last but not least, for the first round, turning to Mr. Ashish Garg, who's for the Energy Development Council, Confederation of Nepali Industries. Now, you've heard of all these different perspectives from the different parts of the ecosystem. From your perspective and, Nepali industry, in your opinion, what are some of the key policy reforms or regulatory measures needed to create this enabling environment for green finance and sustainable investment in Nepal's financial sector and, and other investments?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm the only one from the private sector here on the panel. So
big
in Nepal,
responsibility on your shoulders.
Yeah. So green financing has, as such, not trickled down the Nepalese industry. The local banks are financing green projects. They are, as such, not doing green financing. They are financing green projects, meaning that the predominantly hydropower and solar, which is picking up, banks are lending to these projects. There is no much difference between normal traditional lending and financing for green projects. So I would like to mention two major policy initiatives which have really worked. One is the central bank has introduced sectoral limits or requirement that say for green energy sector, 6.5% loan portfolio has to be allocated for that. Because of that, the banks have been forced to lend to hydropower projects or solar projects. And also, two banks floated green bonds. So that had very good response at very low interest rate. So because of this central bank policy, things worked. Second is, a product on rooftop for industries, rooftop solar, where, the UK Nepal Renewable Energy Program, there was a grant and all the industries grabbed it, most of the industries, and that has helped to green the industries and replace to some extent coal or furnace oil or other fossil fuels. So these two initiatives have worked, but the journey is long. The issue remains, one is the green taxonomy. That has to come in very soon. We heard that by the end of this month, we will have that. So that will lay down the foundation of what is green and what is brown or black, and things will move. Second is the hedging. So when we get hedging for the currency risk, when we get international green funds, it comes in US dollar denominated. The currency is non-Nepalese, whereas we earn in Nepalese rupee. So who will foot the bill of this huge bill? Or, I would say there are no institutions as such providing hedging. So that is also on our government's table. Another major issue is the carbon credits or renewable energy certificates for taking up decarbonization or renewable energy project. We don't have a mechanism here. It's there in India, it's there in other countries. So I think the government has to take up that so that the private sector is incentivized to further green up their energy consumption or their activity. And not the least, the sovereign institutions in Nepal, like say HIDCL, the Hydro Investment Company, or banks like NIFRA, they should access international capital with their sovereign rating. Because the private sector banks, Nepal is not rated, so private sector banks will have a hard time to get this capital in. So at the moment, the capital is not much, the green capital here in Nepal. We as private sector developers or industry, we have to borrow in the normal conditions. So a lot of expectations and a lot of, I would say, things to do.
Thank you very much. Lots of positive examples as well for what financial institutions are doing, but also indications of very concrete things that need to be done by the central bank and others to really to accelerate that progress. Now, turning back to Secretary Marasini, in terms of what you've heard, and also the potential for public-private partnerships, which could help to make some of this much easier for the private sector in terms of the green economy agenda, how is the government facilitating such collaborations?
Well, thank you for this second round opportunity. And of course, if we see this summit itself is an example of government's priority to mobilize the public-private partnership in our economic development, and that too also in greening our economy. As Mr. Garg was just mentioning the central bank's policy, that there is a mandatory provision that the banks and financial institutions in Nepal, they have to allocate certain amount of fund on the renewable energy side in hydropower production. So that these two stories already tell you that how seriously government of Nepal has been taking on the forging the PPP in our economy and also in greening our economy. Not only that, we have been also participating in the COP initiatives and recently in Doha as well. Though, Doha itself is a Gulf country, they are known for the, fossil fuels. But Nepal raised very strongly how much it has been affected because of the global climate change. We have pleaded for the green financing, international support, even from those type of those kind of fossil fuel producing and very rich countries, shifting their priority towards greening the economy and also to channeling the funds towards the renewable energies or green sector. As much has been already discussed, and I have also mentioned to you that in my earlier answer, the government not only focusing on or to some private sectors, but it has started demonstrating from its own policy. We have established the Investment Board of Nepal, and we do have this Public-Private Partnership and Investment Act already in place. So these are the institutional and legal frameworks that provide us, the way how we can force this PPP in Nepal. And also we have been supporting the bank and financial institutions through capacity building, through policy flexibilities, and also providing some tax incentives, and also offering financial incentives to encourage private sector participations in green projects. And also government is actively engaged in dialogue with the private sector to identify areas of collaborations and develop joint initiatives to promote green investment and sustainable development. We are also committed for SDGs by 2030. There also we have been allocating our funds and also putting priorities both to adaptation and mitigation. So these are some examples how government is promoting PPP in Nepal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So turning now to Mr. Pereira Porto from the World Bank on the same theme of collaborative approaches, innovative financing. Can you discuss the role of the bank in terms of innovative financing mechanisms and partnerships to scale up green economy projects in Nepal, particularly under the grid? And maybe this is a chance for those of us who don't know, very succinctly to tell us what's the grid and what's the innovative approach that the bank is taking to that.
Okay, thank you. Well, the grid is another strategic approach, and it means a green, resilient, and inclusive development. And here in Nepal, the government is working with more than a dozen partners, like development financial institutions, international community, with stakeholders here in Nepal, inside Nepal. And it's very ambitious in a way that it provides what here in Nepal, you say like the 10 plus 10 plus 10, meaning that there is 10 transition plans, which encompasses, for example, transition toward adaptation of agricultural sector, sustainable cities and green housing, sustainable transportations, you name it, many different sort of transition plans. Nepal plans to use convening all of these partnerships around $10 billion to be invested in the next 10 years. That's why they call it 10 plus 10 plus 10. So it's a very ambitious plan. The action plan is actually being discussed at this very moment with dozens of partners. And the World Bank Group, the World Bank, the IFC, and other institutions under the World Bank Group is collaborating on the discussions of the action plan of the grid, and is also preparing a particular plan in order to provide concessional finance, in order to provide innovative financial instrument, blending finance, technical sharing, capacity building, in order to promote innovative approaches to those transition plans, which is very important. So we must acknowledge that we need to have the focus, and we need to know exactly what to do in order to achieve those particular targets. And the design of innovative financial instruments, not only on the government, so it's on the private sector as well. And to make it happen, there are other things that should be considered alongside. And the World Bank Group is also working on with some public entities here in Nepal, for example, the Central Bank of Nepal. So we're working with them in 3 particular initiatives. First, identifying risks for the financial sector here in Nepal. And that's important because that could guide central bank on further actions in terms of regulatory framework, in terms of supervisory enhancement. So that's a very important point to mitigate market failures. So working on the risk perspective. On the data and information availability in Nepal, so it's important to work on disclosure, to work on reporting. The central bank is already working on the sustainable taxonomy, which is quite important, not only for the regulator, but for financial institutions, for investors. There are many advantages of that, because it lowers transaction costs, it facilitates monitoring flows, it facilitates designing new financial instruments like green bonds, like green loans. And I think this is a very important momentum. And the World Bank Group is pretty aware of the need to understand investment needs and work with the financial authorities and the private sector in order to divide the best potential options under the grid, and of course encompassing other actions under the nationally determined contributions, which there's a set of actions there that is going to be encompassed by the action plan under the grid.
Thank you. Now turning to Mr. Wing, so if you can be quite brief. In addition to the points you've already made, in terms of some of the key challenges that financial institutions face, any additional suggestions for how these can be addressed in the Nepal context, for example?
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's easy to be brief when I think a lot of the key topics have already been discussed and the challenges, so I won't recycle that. I think what is important is to highlight, as a private sector financial institution, one of our key accountabilities, of course, is our home regulator. So as a UK regulated bank, our needs and maybe our thresholds are very high. And that translates into our clients, that translates in the transactions we support, and also translates in our need to disclose. There's benefits, but also challenges that brings. So, to your question, of course, within some of our more developed markets, this is business as usual. Trying to bring such taxonomies, expectations into frontier markets is A, not easy, but B, nor should it be expected. So that's the journey that we're on. So as a bank, we do have our own net zero commitments, so that's a catalyst, as do many of our other counterparties that work with us in that financial ecosystem. The second piece is, jumping through, so how do we help as a firm, right, in collaboration with my colleagues here on the dais? It is that blended finance piece. It's easy to say, it's almost a cliche, but it comes down to people, it comes down to conversations, and it comes down to collaboration. We don't act as one. We all have our incentives, we all have our priorities, but we are being brought together by the need to address climate change. And I think if ever there was a mission to bring us together, that really is. And the Honourable Secretary really underlines what is very key is that policy continuity and confidence that allows investors to come in scale.
Thank you. And also a very important point about the taxonomy being comparable and interoperable to make it easier for institutions like yours and others really to see how these align. In terms of the IFC, any practical examples come to mind of how grant and concessional finance can be used to support underserved areas in particular? Because we've heard also a lot about how the green transition really needs to be inclusive. And the inclusivity theme is something we haven't really touched on a lot, but really has to go hand in hand with green. So any thoughts on that?
When we think about de-risking and, first of all, I think de-risking, the focus, first of all, has to be on the regulation in place that is actually creating an enabling environment. So we can't actually structure away regulation that is not inclusive and supportive of private sector investment. On the IFC side, when we look at concessional funding, and the concessional funding we use is usually blended finance, similar to what Jason has mentioned. And when we focus on blended finance and concessional funding, our immediate focus is not to crowd out private sector investment or commercial bank funding. Our focus is actually to crowd in commercial bank funding, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. The whole idea behind our ethos is to make sure that we are mobilizing private capital. So we can't do it, and we won't do it all ourselves. In terms of blended finance, I mentioned before the Opportunity project. That was one of our largest blended finance instruments that we have used in Nepal and actually in the region. And the focus when we think about concessional financing is, first of all, what is the additionality that we as IFC are providing? Is this something that a Standard Chartered can do on their own? If Standard Chartered can provide the financing, then there really is no need for us, right? So we will come in primarily where there's a risk profile that commercial banks are not typically comfortable in funding. So that's really the basis of the additionality. Then secondly, is there a climate element? Does it support climate investment? Does it support climate mitigation and adaptation? And then thirdly, are we actually helping to build the market? So it shouldn't be a case of we are always here to provide the concessional funding. It should be a case of we do the first maybe 1 to 3 projects, and after that we've built significant resilience in the market, and it can now be carried out by commercial funding.
Very true. So I think really the importance of looking at also how do you get the transition towards economic sustainability over time, through these various types of de-risking and acceleration. Mr. Ashish Garg, the last word goes to you. What do you see as the role for industry associations such as CNI of really accelerating all these different initiatives, and what are some of the gaps from your side that you would like to highlight?
Thank you. So as I mentioned, currently there is not much gap between interest rate for a normal project and a green project in Nepal. Now the primary reason is, I think the currency risk and cost of it. So as in the industry association, we have been lobbying the voice of the industry to not only banks but DFIs and international funds. So say for example, how we have been working is, say for rooftop solar, the National Renewable Energy Program, they came up with this scheme of what up to 1 megawatt of solar rooftop at concessional subsidized cost. So we went to our industry, maybe a cement factory or a steel factory, and we explained them that the benefit of this, and then the things started moving in. There were practical issues while implementing this, which were communicated to the NREP program also. So we are basically a bridge. Once we understand, then we are able to explain to our industry and to the lending institution. The journey, as I mentioned, we have just embarked on the journey. There is a long way to go. Say for infrastructure projects like hydro, we still have floating interest rate, short tenors, personal guarantee based recourse project financing. So these are green projects, but we are still doing it in a traditional way. So a lot of policy initiatives have to be taken, and then it will be a real green in the real sense. And as industry will expect some incentive, though it is everyone's responsibility to be green. It's a matter of survival of mankind, but our industry would need some incentives, some concession to adopt these green practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that reality check, and really also all the mismatches you're dealing with, and how do we really get that kind of green responsive finance. Let me thank all the panelists and turn back to the MC.
Thank you very much to our moderator. And thank you to all our speakers and all our panelists as well for bringing forth your insights from your own experiences and from your field as well. May I now please request our session chair, Honorable Dr. Min Bahadur Shrestha, Vice Chair, National Planning Commission, for his closing remarks of this session.
Thank you. Ms. Radhika Lal, SDG Finance Policy Advisor, UNDP's Regional Hub, Thailand. Mr. Madhukumar Marasini, Secretary, Ministry of Finance, Government of Nepal. Mr. Rodrigo Pereira Porto, Senior Financial Sector Consultant, World Bank Group. Mr. Jason Wing, Sustainability Partnerships Lead, Chief Sustainability Office, Standard Chartered Bank. Ms. Idor Ono Makpome, Infrastructure International Finance Corporation. Mr. Ashish Garg from CNI, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste. As we bring this session of Nepal Investment Summit 2024 to a close, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for your participation and engagement in this significant event. Throughout our time together, we have delved into the crucial theme of harnessing finance for sustainable investments, recognizing the vital role it plays in our nation's development trajectory. We find ourselves at a pivotal moment in history where climate change and environmental degradation demand urgent action. The recent global climate reports have underscored the necessity for sustainable development, making it clear that we are running out of time to address these pressing issues effectively. Nepal, like many nations, faces the impacts of climate change, from the rapid melting of Himalayan glaciers to the increasing frequency of natural disasters. Our natural resources are not only national treasures, but also crucial for our economy and society. As we move forward, it is imperative that we prioritize sustainable investments to protect and enhance our natural capital. The Nepal Investment Summit 2024 has provided us with a platform for dialogue, collaboration, and action. It has been an opportunity for us to exchange ideas and explore innovative financing mechanisms to drive sustainable development across various sectors of our economy. In Nepal, most of the things are green. About 45% of our land is forest, that's green. 29% of our land is under cultivation and they produce green agriculture. Out of the rest, we have rivers and snow-capped mountains, which are the source of greenery and green energy. Our development framework and various legal provisions also are green, as they set various criteria for green development. Sometimes there are delays in project initiation due to these provisions. National Planning Commission of Nepal has finalized the 16th development plan, which is coming into implementation starting from coming July. Major interventions proposed in the 16th plan means investment opportunities for the private sector. We are designing various interventions to make sure we can achieve economic growth, annual average economic growth of 7.1% during the plan period. We have estimated that about 9.2 trillion Nepalese rupees will be required for the implementation of various major programs during the 16th plan. Several projects have been showcased and various investment opportunities available in Nepal have been discussed in this investment summit. I would like to highlight the investment opportunities available in other green sectors. The first is agriculture sector, including livestock. We are looking for the investment to establish large-scale agriculture and livestock farms. We are importing agricultural products in a huge amount. Therefore, there is an ample market within the country for agriculture produces and also can be exported specifically to the Gulf countries. Another area for investment is high-value herbal farms producing various medicinal plants, including cordyceps. We call it Versagumba in Nepali. We are also looking for investment and innovative models in use of forest and developing new forests. We have plenty of forest, but we are importing timber and furniture products in a huge amount. Water resources is being used in hydroelectricity production, and there are a few projects proposed in this area in this summit as well. Drinking water is another area of investment. Water export will start soon to Moon and Venus. So we can open the investment in conservation and harvesting of glacier water that can be exported to other planets. So far, underwater glass tunnels are in use to observe the activities of sea creatures in some countries. Let's think about construction of glass tunnels overland going up to base camp of Mount Everest and other mountains. This will ensure the conservation of the environment and make possible for common people to reach the base camp and have a closer view of mountains. We need innovation in green finance. Innovation is happening, but we need more. The 16th plan has embraced various initiatives to promote the green economy. It encourages banks and financial institutions to invest in green projects and adopts the concept of green finance taxonomy and green bond practices. Concessions are provided for investments that improve energy efficiency in domestic and business uses, reduce carbon emissions, and enhance climate adaptability. The plan includes measures to offset environmental protection and adaptation expenses through tax adjustments and environmental fees based on carbon emissions. To achieve our sustainable development goals, we must leverage the power of green finance to mobilize resources for projects promoting renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, waste management, and climate resilient infrastructure. By investing in these sectors, we not only protect our environment, but also create new opportunities for economic growth, job creation, and poverty alleviation. Today, we stand on the brink of a new era, an era that demands bold and decisive action. Together, let's seize this moment to harness the power of green finance for sustainable investment, ensuring a prosperous and resilient future for generations to come. Our collective commitment to sustainable development will not only benefit our country, but will also contribute to global efforts to combat climate change and preserve our planet for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our chair for this wonderful session, Honorable Dr. Min Bahadur Shrestha, Vice Chair, National Planning Commission. And may I now please request our session chair to present this token of appreciation to our presenter and to our panelists as well. Can we please have the token of appreciations in the center stage, and may I please request our presenter and our moderator, Ms. Radhika Lal, to kindly accept this token of appreciation for being a part of the second parallel session, Green Finance for Sustainable Investment, here at Nepal Investment Summit 2024. We'd also like to thank and request Mr. Madhukumar Varasini, Secretary, Ministry of Finance, to kindly step forward, sir, and accept this token of appreciation from our side. Thank you very much for sharing your valuable insights on what work has currently being done in Nepal in terms of green financing. May I also please request Ms. Idoro Onomakpomo, Infrastructure Industry Manager, Asia Pacific for the International Finance Cooperation, to kindly accept this token of appreciation from Nepal Investment Summit 2024. Would like to also request Mr. Rodrigo Porto, Senior Financial Sector Consultant, World Bank Group, to kindly accept our token of appreciation for being a part of the panel. Would like to request you to accept this from our session chair. Would also like to request Mr. Jason Wing, Sustainability Partnerships Lead at Standard Chartered Bank Singapore, to kindly accept this token of appreciation. And we'd also like to request Mr. Ashish Garg, Chair of the Energy Council at CNI, to kindly accept this token of appreciation. And thank you very much, sir, for being a part of this Green Finance for Sustainable Investment session. May I now please kindly request the CEO of Investment Board of Nepal, Mr. Sushil Bhatta, to kindly join us onto the stage to present a token of appreciation to our session chair. And thank you very much to Honorable Dr. Min Bahadur Shrestha, Vice Chair of the National Planning Commission, for graciously accepting our invitation and for being a wonderful session chair in this session. Would like to request Sushil sir to kindly stay back for a group photograph. Would like to take a group photo with all our panelists and our session chair as well. All right. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being a part of this session. We'd like to take a group photograph to mark the ending of this session on harnessing green finance for sustainable investment. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being a wonderful audience as well. We'd like to announce that we now have our lunch break. So the lunch break will be out in the garden where it was yesterday. We'd like to request all of you to kindly join us back inside the hall. In this particular hall, we have the next session on ICT, a vibrant investment platform, where you'll get to understand the ICT scenario in Nepal. So if you're interested, please do join us after the lunch break here at this hall. Thank you very much. And please leave your headsets behind. We'd like to remind you to kindly leave your headsets behind before you head out for lunch.